So I don't know. We have to have the conversation, and we have to have the conversation about what it implies, right? And in some sense, the good news about COVID-19 is that it showed how vulnerable we are.
The Umbrella Corporation thought they'd contained the infection. Well, they were wrong. Raccoon City was just the beginning. Within weeks, the T-virus had consumed the United States. The virus didn't just wipe out human life. Lakes and rivers dried up, forests became deserts, and whole continents were reduced to nothing more than barren wastelands. Slowly but surely, the Earth began to wither and die.
Don't want to bother you with it. I've been being called a conspiracy theorist and stuff. You've got Politico being funded by the weapons industry. I mean, doesn't that sound like a conspiring, a sort of a desired mutual outcome from two powerful entities, Politico and the weapons industry? Does pointing that out make me a conspiracy? I've got a theory. What's the theory? Well, it's crazy. The weapons industry. The weapons industry. They're giving Politico money, right? Yeah, they are doing that. We've got facts. We can see that. We've got the bank accounts. Yep, that's all true. Right, but what if, Politico, when they're writing about the war, like they say stuff that would be good for the weapons industry? You sick son of a bitch. Sorry, it's my new meds. I got him off Pfizer. Hey!
This is Antonio Galvin, Soybean Association's president, quote, criticizing international sanctions, quote, the sanctions are preventing fertilizers from getting to producing countries. How many millions are going to starve to death because of the lack of these fertilizers?
Should rattle Putin's cage, and journalists at White House press conferences continue to goad the administration into more aggressive posturing. Go on. Oh, I'm a very old man. Go on, posture. I learned this one from looking at my son's laptop. Cable news viewership has jumped during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Oh, what a coincidence. CNN, Fox and MSNBC collectively averaged 6.4 million viewers in prime time. That's up from their January average of 4 million. CNN's audience soared from 633,000 in January to 1.75 million last week, up 178%. And MSNBC had 980,000 for its war coverage, up 51% over January. But to make a connection between those rising viewer figures and increased advertising revenue, that would come from the kind of organisations that also might be broadly supportive of war, and pundits that are supportive of war, and the cold, hard facts that 90% of coverage in those three publications that is broadly representative of the mainstream media was explicitly pro-war. To make any connection between those facts would make you...
If you want to get a glimpse of the future, what the future is going to look like, it's going to be that like all the time, which is, we're almost there now. It's that all the time. For someone somewhere on the planet, it's that kind of weird stuff all the time.
Open areas of research right now. And, this is taking place within the Arctic.
On the land and our food security, water security issues?
Well, I think and that can be coming very soon, contrary to what you read in the peer-reviewed literature. The people who actually produce the peer-reviewed literature are not publishing this information, but they're letting it out in interviews. For example, James Anderson, the atmospheric scientist at Harvard, who famously linked chlorofluorocarbons in the hole in the Antarctic. He said in an interview with Forbes magazine in January of 2018 that we will have an ice-free Arctic Ocean next year, with full effects being realized the following year. Jennifer McKinnon, when she was interviewed by CBS News in April 2021, indicated that probably we'll have an ice-free Arctic Ocean this year. Perhaps it'll be next year. But if we look at the best case scenario of those two well-informed individuals, then that indicates that we can expect an ice-free Arctic next year with full effects, meaning loss of albedo and release of even more methane and so on in 2024, which is not long from now. There, as you know, as everybody here knows, there are dozens of so-called tipping points, self-reinforcing feedback loops that we can talk about involving freshwater, land systems, overheating in general. What relatively few people know is that the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, which was the predecessor to the IPCC, indicated that 1 degree C was the absolute upper limit, that was the point at which things would start falling apart. And they started falling apart before then. In fact, David Spratt, science writer and speaker about climate change, says we triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops at a 0.5 degree C above the 1750 baseline. So we're already dealing with, quote, runaway climate change with respect to those self-reinforcing feedback loops and the inability to turn back the clock. Finally, the IPCC acknowledged that we were in the midst of abrupt and irreversible climate change with 2 separate reports, 3 and 4 years ago. And yet nobody seems to be paying much attention to that information. When the IPCC, perhaps the most conservative scientific body in the history of the planet, when they conclude that we're in the midst of abrupt climate change and irreversible climate change, that should be on the news every day. Really. And instead, we just see celebrity blah, blah, blah.
They cancelled John Rowling recently, the children's author. Her books are published all over the world, even just because she didn't satisfy the demands of gender rights. They're not trying to cancel our country. I'm talking about the progressive discrimination of everything to do with Russia, this trend that's unfolding in a number of Western states.
On the news every day. At least the last time I looked at the news 30 or 40 years ago, that was the case.
Where there is no snow and a wildfire.
Aspetto consciente. E voilà, with the stick.
Always we need distraction from the main issue.
Right.
Right now in the Netherlands, we cannot buy 2 sunflower oil. We need coupon. We can get only 1 sunflower oil in a day.
We've got to get better at this, and we've got to get good at recognizing that there's a spectrum of possibilities about what actually happened here, right? The story that you described there, I think, is probably at least partially true, where people, when they saw this thing emerge, they had plans already in place to allow them to capitalize on it, right? To use it for things they wanted to do anyway, right? For making tyrannical incursions into our rights, right? They had that on their agenda and they needed a way to do it. And suddenly, oh, COVID, that's it. All right, let's do that.
Jesus. Well, I could feed half of Brazil on these caterpillars. Take a wild guess where Brazil sells most of its soybeans to. This is a real brain teaser. Brazil, in turn, sells most of its soybeans to China, which uses much of that crop to feed livestock. Fewer, more expensive soybeans could force ranchers to cut back on such animal feed, meaning smaller cows, pigs, and chickens, and higher prices for meat. John Bacon House, a corn and soybean farmer in Hastings, Iowa, said he prepared for fertilizer late last year because he worried about a looming shortage. His fertilizer, he prepaid for his fertilizer late last year because he worried about a long-time shortage. His fertilizer still has not arrived, and he now has less than a month to apply it to his corn crop. Without it, He said his yields will be halved. Quoting Farmer Bakehouse, you know, when they show the cars jumping in slow motion and the passengers inside are up in the air? That's what it feels like. We're all just
Giving us an important clue. The ESAS, or Eastern Siberian Antarctic, seems to be having a hard time. Look how hot. This is the February 2022 temperature anomaly. That is just red hot, just on fire. February. That's not good. Mind-boggling. And it reminds me of, you know, last year when we had crazy heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, and you had, you know, record-breaking heat day in Canada one day, and then, you know, 2 days later there was a wildfire that swept through the same area, and then a few months later there was a flood in the same area. But nothing's going on. No. Club of Rome, you know, making shit up. Once snow-capped ski resorts on fire in Europe. So this is a ski resort where there is no snow. There's supposed to be snow there, but there is no snow there because it's... Anybody? That's what it is. Once in Europe, over 40 C warmer and be Arctic in similar meltdown, and this is just at 1.2 C, right? And politicians think 1.5 C in just 5 years is safe. Ice shelf of Thwaites Glacier to collapse in just 3 years. So here's some footage from what is supposed to be a ski resort.
We need to recognize the possibilities, and I think a good, healthy dose of agnosticism about what has taken place is important, because it may be actually that there's more to this than we know.
Yeah, the idea that you mentioned is about what kind of world are we leaving behind here for the kids? It's so I'm of an age where I remember what the world looked like when I was a boy, because I was called Nature Boy. I was always outside, and I delighted in just catching things, turtles, snakes, frogs, fish, insects, whatever. So I was out there. And I didn't realize, to me, I just took it for granted, like this is the world I live in, right? And I distinctly remember when my family's has a summer place upstate New York on a Finger Lake. And I remember as a boy, literally being wonderfully frightened. I love this kind of frightening. When you would turn on the porch light, and if you came back later, the screen door would be covered with this like terrifying array of things, right? Giant walking sticks, huge staghorn beetles, big sphinx and luna moths. It was just, things banging in that you couldn't quite resolve. And last 5 years, nothing. Like you can leave the window open all night with a light on inside, and if you get one lonely moth, you're lucky now. So that level of horrifying change to me tells me that we don't just need to sort of like point out that Anthony Fauci is a bad guy. That what we need is if evolution, if consciousness can come in and help redirect itself a little bit, we've got some growing up to do as a species. Like COVID can be a wake up call, and I think it has been for many people, but I think it has to wake us up to something even bigger than a failure of the CDC to be an effective institution. It has to wake us up to something bigger than, geez, can we get a couple of better candidates for president next time? It's much bigger than that. And so I don't know how to get at that yet at this point in time, but that's really where I'm steering my efforts, is using COVID as a means of reaching people who are ready to wake up and use our brains towards abundance and regeneration rather than just extraction and depletion. And that's as close as I've gotten to it. And I'm not remotely smart enough to know how to begin doing anything other than having the conversation and hoping people are attracted to that. And that's what I see this year is about, is we have to have that conversation, because in my lifetime, I've seen the oceans have become almost sterile, and I'm using that word very carefully compared to what they were when I was
Yeah,
a
I've
boy.
seen exactly the same thing. And
Dr. Tyson and Dr. Krippner in regards to volcanic emissions and climate change. Does volcanic activity release more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than human activity? Now, climate obfuscators often cite volcanic activity as one of the main contributors to greenhouse gases on Earth. So
Janine, where do volcanoes fit in the equation, in the greenhouse equation?
So looking at carbon dioxide alone, which as we know is a very large culprit, humans release through fossil fuels and other activities 40 to 100 times more than all volcanoes. So under the ocean and on land. There's a huge program, the Deep Carbon Observatory, that's been actually looking into this. And no, we are releasing so much more than volcanoes.
So volcanoes are not the problem. They shouldn't even be part of the conversation because they're going to do what they're going to do anyway, right?
They are. They helped us get our atmosphere in the beginning, and they're a very important part of the natural carbon cycle and our atmosphere and all these nutrients. But as far as what we're seeing now with climate change or global warming or whatever you want to call it, they are not the culprit. We are.
Of the global food supply, which is 100% dependent on fossil fuels. Every aspect of the global food supply is dependent on fossil fuels. Brazil, the world's largest producer of soybeans, those soybeans which are being grown on what used to be the Amazon rainforest, the Pantanal and the Chaco, those soybean fields. Brazil, the world's largest producer of soybeans, purchased nearly half of its fertilizer from Russia and Belarus. It now has just 3 months of stockpiles left. The National Soybean Farmers Association has instructed its members to use less fertilizer. If any fertilizer this season, Brazil's soybean crop, already diminished by a severe drought, is likely to be even smaller.
this is, it's funny. The folks on the center right who we end up interacting with now are correct about a good many things. And this is one of the things I think they're way wrong about. And I think we have to have that conversation with our natural partners on both left and right so that we can upgrade our collective model. And let me just be candid about your observation about the insects. I've made exactly the same observation, and I was a very creature-oriented kid too. And so I played a lot in nature as much as possible, and I caught creatures just like you. And I remember a world in which a summer drive down the highway resulted in just an awful, very difficult to clean up mess on the windshield, right? The number of insects that died on the windshield of your car was a real problem, right? They were sticky, and there were products that were sold, you could read in a magazine products to get the goo off your windows because it wasn't an easy job. But the point is, the world has changed. The oceans are so much less diverse than they once were, or maybe diverse is the wrong word, but there's so much less in them, right? And the number of insects is way down, and there are places you can go where you used to hike and see, a diversity of birds. You couldn't avoid seeing it, and now you see nothing. And here's the part I got wrong. I would have said as a 20-year-old that if the collapse of the insect population was as severe as you and I both know it is, that would have had catastrophic effects on agriculture, for example. And I don't think it has. I think agriculture has pivoted, and it functions differently than it once did. It is a much more robust process because it's high tech. It's robust to this particular insult. It's feeble with respect to many other things. So, for example, the super crops, right? Super corn. isn't super at all, right? It's incredibly weak. The point is it grows incredibly big if you dump fertilizer on it, but it's completely incapable of growing, with any sort of natural competition in the absence of those inputs. So anyway, we're living in some system that didn't behave according to the fears that I had, but nonetheless, the collapse of the insect population is every bit as severe as we worried it would be, and maybe more severe. So, and not just at the level of our biology. It showed how vulnerable we are to propaganda and to being induced to viciousness toward each other and to demonizing those who are trying to tell us things we need to know, right? So this was a trial run. And if we learned the lesson of it, we could come out of it much stronger. But then again, that's the reason that I'm afraid the lesson is going to be buried.
So I'm keen on this, like how we get out of this. And it's a multi-step process. So you've bumped into one of the aspects of this for me, which is the mass psychosis story, mass formation, more technically. I like the word psychosis because, well, it's sort of more evocative, but the idea that there were a group of people who fell prey rather easily to a set of narratives that were not just provably false, but demonstrably, ridiculously provably false. But I understand the process that we got here, and it's disappointing to me because these events that we're spending so much time in this mass formation event, and we're not using that energy for other things that I think really need and deserve our like full attention.